Black Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Welcome to Card Table, continuing our look at Volume 8, One-Eyed Jacks. I think we are up to the Melinda Snodgrass story, The Devil's Triangle. The Devil's Triangle is set, so at this point the book has sort of taken you through a sort of year in the life, although it's sort of like a television year where it started in the fall of one year and now we're into the spring of the following year. So I don't know if that's deliberate. It sort of feels like one season of television, or maybe a school year, which was always appropriate for me and my friend John reading these in school. So from the fall of '88 to the spring of '89. So Chris Claremont's story is set, set actually technically in the summer of '88, where we're introduced to Cody Havero, who's the new chief of surgery at the Jokertown Clinic, employed by Tachyon, and then there's also a bit of romantic tension between her and Tachyon. So now we're at sort of the spring or summer of the following year, so at this point they've been working together for a full year, and they're still sort of flirting and haven't yet actually connected, but the idea is that there's been sort of a year of sort of sexual tension. But then the wrench in the works is Tachyon's grandson Blaze, who I can't remember if I've talked about him too much, but the idea there is that he back in the 50s, Tachyon had a relationship with a woman named Denelle, and left her pregnant. Didn't realize it, but when he left Paris in the 50s, she was pregnant. Had a daughter, and then that daughter had a son. The daughter died, but the son was still alive, was born in 1975. I believe they established in one of the books that he was born in 1975. And so Tachyon discovers this 11-year-old French kid whose telepathic powers he's inherited from his grandfather, and now he's sort of being exploited by this terrorist cell. And so Tachyon sort of defeats the terrorist leader, Le Miroir, and takes his grandson for himself and takes him back to the United States. So there, I don't think I wanted to spoil all that when I was actually talking about Volume 4, but now we're on Volume 8, so hey. So that's where that's at now. Somewhere in there, I believe they fudge Blaze's age a little bit, because if he was born in 75, I think they literally tell you his birth date, because they find his birth certificate. So he was born in May of 75, so at this point in the narrative, he should be 14, because it's now like June of '89. But I think they keep referring to him as 15, and then in the next volume, a year later, he's 16. So somewhere in there, they gave Blaze a little extra year, I think, because they wanted to make him a villain right away. They didn't want to wait another year, and so they were like, well, a 15-year-old villain sounds a little like, that seems a little young. Like, you can't deal with a 15-year-old kid, at least 16. It's like, it's old enough to drive, and they sort of imply that maybe like sort of the wild genetics of mixing Tahitians with humans has led to maybe some somewhere in there a little bit of growth spurt energy, I guess, that has made Blaze seem much more robust and buff and physically more sort of physically effective than your average teenage boy would be. For those of you who, like me, are a little bit overly chronologically minded, what can I say? There's no point apologizing now. If you've noticed a year gap, a strange little year-long, a strange little jump in age, kind of like what they do on all those TV shows, I suppose, right? They always kind of age them up a little faster. It was the Family Ties kid, right, who went from like a baby to a 4-year-old in 1 year. So something akin to that. And then didn't on Star Trek: The Next Generation, which there's Snodgrass again. I think it was during her tenure, in fact, that we got to see Worf's son, who also had kind of aged a little bit quickly. and was maybe even played by the same actor as the one who played the Family Ties kid. Did I have that right? I don't know. There's some kind of connection there between Family Ties, Star Trek, and Melinda Snodgrass. There's clearly talk about the Devil's Triangle. So that's sort of the hitch in the works, is that Blaze is growing up to become this sort of physically scary kind of lad who is got a really dangerous level of psychic power, and also seems to be growing up to be psychotic, possibly a result of having run with terrorists and being exploited by terrorists during his childhood. And then he has a very traumatic experience in Volume 7, which I didn't really go into too much detail about, not wanting to spoil it, but the kid goes through some stuff, and so that all sort of, it's implied that all of that stuff has kind of destabilized this kid's mind, and so now he's a dangerous kid, and he really hates his grandfather Tachyon, and he is in love with Cody Havero, the same woman that Tachyon is into, which I believe that's the love triangle of the title of the Devil's Triangle, is the Tachyon, Blaze, Cody, that triangle of relationships. There were sort of intimations in the early books that Blaze was going to grow up to be kind of dangerous, and now it's finally happened. They were sort of setting it up really from the start, over the courses of really all the previous Blaze appearances in 4, 5, 6, and 7, and now boom, Volume 8 is when that really kind of comes to pass, where Blaze and Tachyon have their first true sort of battle, and then Blaze runs off to be initiated by Loophole Latham and become a jumper, and ultimately ends up as pretty much rises up almost immediately as sort of the leader of the jumpers. Loophole Latham is the sort of implicit leader of the jumpers as their creator. But if the gang of teenagers is said to have sort of an alpha teenager, Blaze is it. So it ends with, pretty much ends with that, with Blaze becoming the leader of the jumpers and sort of swearing vengeance on his, basically saying that Tachyon is going to wish that Blaze had only killed him, implying that he's got some fate in store for Tachyon that is worse than death, which you don't see it till Volume 9, but it does actually seem like a fate worse than death. It's one of the times when it's not just a cliche. Snodgrass really delivers on that promise. It's pretty vile, and I'm sort of laughing more out of discomfort than I am out of. It's certainly not a comical fate. It's pretty nasty. So, but we'll get to that. But it is so. Again, I kind of mentioned before, it's sort of a motif of these books that, or a motif of this particular book, that every story is really kind of ending with a sort of hint of like, next time things are going to really hit the fan, and they do. I will say, when you get to Volume 9, definitely a lot of this stuff does pay off. But certainly, again, I mentioned in the first Book 8 video about how I picked this one up. It was the first one I was reading in real time, where I couldn't just, as soon as I was done, read the next one. And very frustrating at the time to have all these sort of open threads. Now, of course, like I said before, you can just, I do suggest maybe having 8 and 9 both in the queue for yourself, so that when you get to the end of Volume 8, you're not going, oh, come on. You can just leap right into Volume 9 and start getting some of the payoffs that this one kind of sets up. In fact, running along that theme, Dead Heart Beating, which is the last story, other than the final part of the Mr. Nobody interstitial, the last story in here is Dead Heart Beating, which is another example, because it's basically, the lead character is Fade Out, who's one of the Shadow Fists, sort of a nemesis of Yeoman, Miller's usual POV character, who is absent from this story, but the whole story is almost just sort of like a setting up of the chess pieces, so that when Yeoman comes back in Volume 9, which, spoilers, he does, he sort of has to deal with the new sort of array of menace and threat that is sort of set up over the course of Dead Heart Beating. So even though it's about Fade Out, it is kind of really a yeoman story. It's just that it's a yeoman story focusing on the bad guys, the Shadow Fists. So Kian, the leader of the Shadow Fists, and Leslie Christian, who is deliberately introduced in the Lazy Dragon story, so that there can be some payoff with him in Dead Heart Beating. Deadhead. A lot of the Shadow Fist favorites. Lazy Dragon is not, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that he's Vivian at the moment. It's a good story. It's got a nice twist that I don't. I'm pretty sure the first time I read the book, I wouldn't have. I don't think I saw it coming, and I feel like even when I reread them years later, having forgotten a lot of plot points, I think I was kind of taken by surprise again. So, pretty good twist. I was surprised. I've been surprised by it twice in the course of my life, which is not bad. So yeah, nice little twist at the end. As always, John Joseph Miller is great at writing just action movie style action in prose form. So yeah, it's a good one. But of course, it is another one where it sort of ends with characters going. It's not quite this on the nose, but it's sort of like, oh, when Yeoman meets us next, we're going to finally take him down. It's got that sort of like, that's very similar energy to the end of the Snodgrass one, of being like, oh, the next time Tachyon has to meet Blaze, bad stuff's going to go down. What's Tachyon going to do? And this one has that same kind of energy, like, what's Yeoman going to do now when he meets the new status quo of the Shadow Fists? So it's another one with that same kind of energy of like, wait till you see what happens next time. None of them are really like hard cliffhangers in the sense of in the quasi literal sense of that term, of someone literally hanging from a cliff, or their life is in danger and how are they going to get out of it. Nothing is left quite that harrowing or immediate in terms of cliffhanger, but they do all have an energy of tune in next time. As a book on its own, well, at the time, a frustrating book in that respect. I remember being like, oh man, there's just so much left open at the end of this book. But now, just viewing it as just one more book in the saga, where you can, as soon as you're done, read the next one. I think this book actually has a lot to recommend it. There's a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting elements to it. I mentioned early on, not just the number of female protagonists, but the diversity of the situation of each female protagonist. They don't feel cookie cutter. Lady Black is this government agent. Veronica being a prostitute. One character is a thief who's in her 60s, teaming up with a little girl who's 8 or 9. Claremont's Cody Havero, this doctor and Vietnam War veteran. So yeah, different occupationally, different socioeconomically, psychologically, where they are in their life, their sexual orientation, their age, their sort of relationship with law and order versus criminal, which side of the law they're on. Lots of diversity in that respect. So I like that element of the book a lot, in terms of how its female protagonists work out, and obviously the two news stories really contribute to that, of course, because before that, 3 of the females that I just mentioned were not lead characters in the book, and now they are. So that helps a lot. I think the Vic Milan story is a real highlight. The Carrie Vaughn story about Lady Black is excellent. Love reading about Lazy Dragon. It's the first true Mr. Nobody story, even though the character had appeared before. This is really the first time we really get in his head. And he, even though he is quite the sad sack over the course of this story, it's a lot of good, like, kind of foundational building of that character. And then he'll eventually become, in some ways, a real quintessential Wild Cards character, I think. One of the sort of emblematic, sort of great characters, certainly a personal favorite of mine, definitely in my top 10 of favorite Wild Cards characters of all time. Mr. Nobody absolutely is on that list. So yeah, overall, a lot of good stuff. Also, I'm struck by, and if you watched all these videos about Volume 8, you might have been struck by it too. All the connections to Fort Freak, Volume 21. I think if you've been paying careful attention to the words that I've been spewing out, not that I'm saying that you should should be paying careful attention, but I certainly would be flattered if you are. But you might have noticed that a lot of times I'm like, oh, that character, you won't see them again until volume 21, or we don't see more about this particular thing until volume 21, or Stephen Lee only wrote about the Oddity as the POV character twice, once here and then later in book 21. So yeah, there's a ton of connections to volume 21. Kevin Andrew Murphy adds a few more. I don't know that it means anything in and of itself, but it's I always like that kind of thing, the sort of interesting little reflections, just the way that this book has a lot of things that end up finding a reflection in Fort Freak, volume 21. So thanks to Kevin Andrew Murphy, his interpolations, Trudy Pirandello, the Magpie, her two major appearances right now are 8 and 21. Obviously she might come back or could be retconned into some other ones, but right now, 8 and 21. The Oddity as a POV character so far has only happened twice, 8 and 21. Jessica Vanderstadt as now, thanks to Kevin Andrew Murphy, her first appearances in this one, and then she comes back after being gone. She's in this one, and then never again until volume 21. Kevin Andrew Murphy also retcons a bunch of Fort Freak police officers like Leo Storgman into this book, and then we'll see Leo Storgman again as a POV character in volume 21. Ben Choi turns into his sister Vivian Choi, and then we don't see her again, Vivian, until we see her as a Fort Freak police officer in volume 21. Dr. Pretorius is introduced along with his mysterious ward, Ice Blue Sybil, and there's clearly some kind of mystery going on with what her deal is, but that pretty much is just left off the table, even though there's quite a bit of introduction to that whole weird relationship of Dr. Pretorius and Ice Blue Sybil after a very explicit introduction here. Don't really see much more about Ice Blue Sybil until volume 21. I always think like hypothetically if someone who had never heard of these books just went to a used bookstore and saw George R.R. Martin's name, and if it just so happened that the only two books that were there were 8 and 21, and they just thought, oh, I'll just buy these and check them out. They would get an interesting sort of view of the Wildcards universe of like, oh, these seem to be the main characters: the Oddity, Trudy Pirandello, the Magpie. Oh, there's Jessica. I remember her. Oh yeah, there's Ice Blue Sybil again. There's Dr. Pretorius again. So there's those Fort Freak, there's Leo Storgman again. Oh, I get it. These are the main characters in Wildcards. And then suppose they then go back and read all the other ones and realize that, oh, actually, no. A lot of those characters are only in 8 and 21 and no other books. Another interesting thing about this book, I can't remember if this is my observation or somebody else's actually, but there is a definite motif kind of running through about, and I don't know exactly what would be like the umbrella term, but there's just this motif of body and mind separation, or one mind occupying more than one body, or more than one mind occupying one body, or one body having multiple forms. So Cody Havero in the first story meets this villain called Sludge, who's this sort of shark-like Joker who wants a mate so badly that his Wildcard's power, I guess, even though he's a Joker, he also has a Wildcard talent, an ace talent, which is to sort of transform any woman who comes within a certain radius of him into a shark, just like him. It's kind of weird, but and so Cody Havero gets kind of caught in that radius, and she sort of feels her flesh start to become gray and rough and shark skin, I guess, essentially. Obviously, we get the Ben Choi and Vivian Choi sharing two minds, sharing a body. The Oddity is three minds sharing a body. Captain Trips is at least 6 different personalities sharing one physical space. Obviously, anyone who gets jumped is sharing their body against their will. Mr. Nobody's ability is to change his form, even though he doesn't change his personality, although it has it has already been established that when he became the great ape, he did sort of lose his personality between some sort of ape-like persona. Yeah, there's a lot in there, a lot about transformation, and a lot of it gets a little bit connected to gender, I suppose, to some degree. There's because when the oddity gets jumped, it's Patty, the female persona, who gets jumped by a character named David, who's like the leader of the Jumpers before Blaze becomes the de facto leader later, which means Patty finds herself finally in one body rather than in the sort of the conglomerate that is the oddity. Patty finds herself in just a single body that she doesn't have to share with two other minds, but it's male and her mind is female. Obviously, in the present day, when we have the mainstream society has a better understanding of trans issues and a lot of the issues related to gender identity that people, at least those of us who weren't living with it back in the 80s and 90s, really didn't have much of an awareness. There just wasn't a lot of mainstream awareness of that stuff, which means I think some of the way it's dealt with in this arc, not just in this book, but with a lot of the Jumper stuff in Volume 9, runs the risk of seeming maybe a little naive in terms of how they address that stuff. There is a lot of stuff about. It's almost the exact opposite of what we've been sort of given to understand now. Where Patty finds herself in a male body and suddenly finds herself, I guess, responding to certain things as a male would, despite the fact that she's a female personality. Whereas these days we sort of are given to understand that it's really the opposite. That whatever the physical body you might find yourself in isn't going to change what your gender is. So there is a bit of I don't know that anyone would find it offensive. I don't think, although I guess I can't say for sure. But like I say, it might probably seem a little naive or maybe even a little quaint, given our broader understanding of that stuff today. But it's still an interesting just motif, just kind of in its own right. I don't know that I personally could say exactly what if there's actually a theme emerging. I mean, there's thematic material emerging, like I say, like common threads. If I could boil that down to a thesis, is another question, and I don't know that I personally could, which I guess isn't surprising given that it's a multitude of writers, each writing their own story. But it is striking, and a lot of it is probably as much plot-driven as anything else. Lazy Dragon, his consciousness occupying these animal bodies like the polar bear that he inhabits. Part of that is just because it works well with the Jumper idea, because when a Jumper attempts to sort of jump into the polar bear's body and then finds that it's actually just an animate statue, that ends up being a problem for the Jumper. And the same, and again, I don't know exactly how this stuff worked out. I believe the way it works is you've got this concept. When they put these Wildcards books together, they've got this concept. They know generally what needs to happen and what needs to be established, and then the different authors pitch. So in that respect, you can sort of see how someone like William F. Wu with a character like Lazy Dragon, or someone like Stephen Lee with the Oddity can sort of come in and say, well, hey, the Oddity would be a great character to deal with a Jumper, because imagine a Jumper leaping into the Oddity and then suddenly realizing that they're racked with pain, and the fact that they've only jumped one of the three personalities. Or with Lazy Dragon, imagine they try to jump not into Lazy Dragon, but into this other body that Lazy Dragon is happens to be inhabiting, which isn't really a body at all. So you can see how maybe those pitches would be very attractive to Martin and or Snodgrass, and they say, oh, so that's a great idea. And then just by virtue of plot mechanics, this theme kind of emerges of characters who, like I say, have bodies that are mutated, or have multiple forms in one body, or multiple minds in one body, or whatever. So it's possible that whole motif and theme, as it were, is just an accident of plot. I don't know. It's one of the things that's kind of fascinating about the book, kind of about the series anyway, about how things, just that ability of the series for things, collective themes or motifs to kind of emerge out of the soup of all these different writers contributing different stuff, where maybe they're only focused on their piece of the puzzle, and then the puzzle that emerges is maybe a surprise to everybody in terms of how it all relates to each other. Not to make it sound like they're totally naive and just stumbling around in the dark, but because obviously a lot of it is very carefully put together. But you can certainly imagine that in putting together a mosaic, which is their word for how the books, how even they might be surprised by certain elements that mirror each other or come to light. I have no idea, for example, if the way Volume 8 and Volume 21 reflect each other, if that was a deliberate thing. I have a feeling it almost could not possibly have been, although Kevin Andrew Murphy may have deliberately made that reflection stronger after noticing it with his interpolated story in Volume 8. Or maybe not. Maybe that was just more coincidence. I'm not sure. So yeah, these themes emerge and reflections emerge. Greg, who I want to talk to, I'm hopefully going to get him to Zoom with me for Volume 9, because he's really good at finding some of these parallels that may or may not be deliberate reflections. Some of the sort of plot turns that have mirrored each other with different characters, and so there's a lot of that stuff to explore. Again, what there is to say about that, and what it means about what they're saying. I can't really. I don't know that I'm inclined to say myself. And especially with the topic as fraught as a sort of gender identity. Looking at a piece of sci-fi genre fiction that was published in 1991. I certainly don't want to get into some of the areas there that might seem a little outdated, and which again I personally don't think are offensive at all. But I could be totally wrong on that. It's possible that someone who's a little more woke than I could read this book and say, "Oh no, this is there's some major problems here." I don't know. I can see areas that seem naive based on what we know now, but not, naive is not the same as offensive. And I guess it's one of those areas where the third person limited POV really does help, because we're not seeing any omniscience here. No one is really pretending an omniscience. It's all just characters sort of speaking their opinions, characters who are of the time, of the 90s or the 80s. I guess there's not too much more to say about that. I'm probably talking in circles a little bit. That should probably be the name of this series, is Talking in Circles, I suppose. But yeah, just something interesting, something maybe worth talking about or worth noting about the book, if nothing else. There's a great bit that I and this is just a total sidebar. I guess we can consider my talk about Volume 8 is essentially done. But there's a really fun sidebar, or I find it fun, in the Vic Milan story that I totally missed at the time, even though I'd seen the movie. But he makes this reference to Field of Dreams, which is a movie that I actually really liked as a kid. In retrospect, I'm kind of embarrassed because I probably read this book right after seeing the movie. It had to have been not long after the movie. But I sort of missed it. So anyone who doesn't know Field of Dreams, because I don't know how much that movie is held up. At the time, it was, well, I don't even know how big it was at the time, I guess. But I really loved that movie when I was a kid. I loved it a lot. Watched it on video several times, and only later did I actually think to, I guess, Wikipedia. We didn't have the internet at the time, and I was just a kid. I had no idea that it was based on a book, and I can't remember the name of the book. I don't think it's called Field of Dreams. I think it's called Shoeless Joe or something like that. So W.P. Kinsella writes this book that is in a genre called magical realism, where it kind of blends fact and fiction, and it's based on his real life, I believe, or there's a sort of avatar for him who's the star of the book, and it's written as if it's nonfiction, and it blends in elements of W.P. Kinsella's real life. And I think in the movie, I think his name is Ray Kinsella in the book. I can't remember. I don't know if it's Ray it's Ray Kinsella in the movie, the character played by what's his face, the one guy from Waterworld. So it's Kinsella Ray Kinsella in the movie. So, and it's W.P. Kinsella writing about as if it's something that really happened to him, with aspects of his real life blended in. But of course, there's all these magical elements that couldn't possibly be what really happened, where he meets these sort of I don't know if they're actually called ghosts, but these sort of avatars that appear to him of certain characters or people who, again, real people like Shoeless Joe Jackson and the Catcher in the Rye guy, J.D. Salinger. J.D. Salinger, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and another baseball player who's a real guy, and he meets these sort of a ghost of Shoeless Joe, and then actually meets J.D. Salinger, who's still alive, but again didn't really meet him in real life, but writes this book as if this is something that really happened, where he met. And then in the movie, I don't think they have the permission to actually have him be J.D. Salinger, so James Earl Jones plays a kind of fictional version of Salinger. And at one point, when he tracks down this author that he's so fond of, I think Terrence Mann, I want to say, is the J.D. Salinger stand-in, much like right up Vic Milan's alley, I suppose, because in the same way that Vic Milan has his character meet Jim Morrison, but can't call him Jim Morrison. So he meets W.P. Kinsella, or he meets J.D. Salinger, but can't call him that. So it's Terrence Mann, and at one point he meets him and says, "Oh my God, you're from the '60s," which is this great line that, I mean, if you're, a 40-year-old guy living in the '80s, then by definition you are from the '60s. But of course, there's a whole load of implication in that one line about you're from the '60s, meaning you're a hippie love child type. And the fake out in the movie is that he says it like, "Oh my God, you're from the '60s!" Like he's so happy to meet one of his people. And then Ray Kinsella is like, "Yeah, I am. Then get out of here," or something like that. So and so it all works very well with Mark Meadows, the last hippie, this character who back in the '60s and '70s was a real square, but then started doing drugs and became more and more hippie-ish over the course of the '70s and '80s. Just at his momentum going more towards being more and more like a hippie as everyone else became more of a yuppie, and that's actually a big thematic element of the Vic Milan story in Volume 8, where he's having a custody battle against his ex-wife, who is now kind of sort of a classic yuppie, kind of married to a lawyer and wearing business suits and such. Whereas Mark Meadows hasn't given up that '60s dream and is looked on as being very naive because of it. And Dr. Pretorius at one point says to him, "Oh my God, you're from the '60s." And Mark Meadows is like, "What?" And Pretorius says, "Oh, so you didn't see that movie that they made based on W.P. Kinsella's autobiography?" And at the time, I didn't realize that Field of Dreams was based on the Kinsella book, and so I didn't get the joke. And now I get the joke. He says the movie based on W.P. Kinsella's autobiography, not W.P. Kinsella's novel, or W.P. Kinsella's book or Flight of Fancy, his autobiography. So the implication being that in the universe of wild cards, where it actually would be possible to meet the avatar of Shoeless Joe, either through some sort of psychometric ability that lets you channel the ghosts of old baseball players, or maybe you're creating them with your own mind. But you absolutely could. You're living in a world where you could build a baseball field in your farm, and in so doing, cause a bunch of ghosts of baseball players to appear, which is what happens in the movie. I don't know exactly if that's exactly what happens in the book, but the point being, it's a great little joke by Vic Milan. It's like blink if you miss it, referring to Kinsella's book as an autobiography instead of as a work of fiction. Pretty brilliant, and also, of course, really ties in the whole relationship between the 60s and the 80s, and idealism versus cynicism, and the sort of hippie ethos versus the very the me decade of the 80s, which is definitely a motif of certainly of the movie Field of Dreams, and probably a motif of the book too, and then a motif that's explored by Vic Milan in that story, and kind of with the Captain Trips character overall. And Vic Milan is definitely one of those people who seems to subscribe to the notion that every decade kind of has its own identity. There's a lot of bits about how Mark about how Mark Meadows just isn't an 80s kind of guy. Of course, the book is set in 1989 when the 80s are about to end anyway. So at one point, J.J. Flash says that he's a bastard of the 90s or something like that. So like ahead of his time a little bit. And so yeah, a lot of good little lines of dialogue in that story. That's just kind of speaks to why Vic Milan is my favorite Wildcards contributor, and why that's my favorite story in that book. I thought a video like this might be a good opportunity to just point out that little Field of Dreams connection that it took me forever to catch. Just because for the longest time, I didn't know that Field of Dreams was based on a book, which is my own fault, I guess. And then once I realized it, being like, oh, now I get that. Now I get it. A very clever moment. I love whenever they do that kind of stuff. There's a lot of that kind of thing of the Wildcards version of a certain writer or of a certain celebrity had a kind of a different career path or lived instead of dying. People like Buddy Holly or Marilyn Monroe, who died in the both of them, having died decades ago. Whereas in the Wildcards world, Buddy Holly is still alive in the 80s, and Marilyn Monroe is still alive at least into the 90s. Freddie Mercury is another one who there's a Fort Freak again, book 21, Fort Freak. There's a really brief mention of the fact that Freddie Mercury is still alive in the year 2010. So there's bits like that, or bits about how a certain character or a certain real-life celebrity is famous for a different reason, like Fidel Castro being a baseball player or whatever. So there are things like that. But I feel like this particular allusion is unique, of taking a book that already kind of mixed fiction with reality, where he did mix bits of autobiography into this obviously fictional fantasy, W.P. Kinsella. And then name checking it in a Wildcard story just to say that, oh, in the Wildcards world, it's just straight autobiography. All that fantastic stuff that couldn't possibly have happened really did, because in the world of Wildcards, it was all totally possible. Pretty brilliant. So yeah, I'd love to see more. I love seeing that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing I also would be happy to see more of in Wildcards. I also think it's wouldn't even mind if like a modern writer went back and alluded to it again, about exactly about the adventures that W.P. Kinsella and J.D. Salinger had on the road tripping together in the world of Wildcards, where that actually did happen. Some fun stuff to explore. So yeah, just something I thought I'd bring up. I wonder if that could be interesting fodder for a Tor essay. Maybe I'll pitch that one to Tor. So on that note, I guess that kind of exhausts what I have to say for now about Volume 8. Obviously, it's a pretty casual little YouTube channel we got going, so if something else occurs to me, I'll just bring it up later. But for now, that hopefully paints a picture of what you got to expect in this one. Anyone who's already read the book and wants to talk about things that I failed to talk about, leave them in the comments, as always. And that's it for now. Next time we'll have a little chat about Volume 9.
Doesn't have any class. She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldrop. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much power. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces.